साथै।
Next time just let us bleed in peace. This is every night it fell cry. Purified, rectified, dignified. For each time we feel previously teased. Next time just let us bleed in peace. This is every night it fell cry. Clarified, justified, dignified. Hi everyone, I'm prepared for this special narration. It is going to be about menstruation. I have a teenage of yours full attention, selecting the pattern of the misconception. Period is a sign of women's health and maturation. Essentially just like a circulation of respiration. There's really no need to put women in seclusion, thinking she has sin. That's a mere delusion. Quite contrary, it's all part of God's creation. The ability to nurture must be a bubble and celebration. Instead we develop protection, not only restriction. Based on the participants and purity conviction. Because many could bubble with proper sanitation. House and the girls stay at their home. Attendance resignation. Mix of embarrassment, shame and irritation. Result in low confidence, poverty. What a combination. For each time we've been previously teased. Next time just let us bleed in peace. This is every night it fell cry. Purified, rectified, dignified. With each time we've been previously teased. Next time just let us bleed in peace. This is every night it fell cry. Purified, justified, dignified. Ask you so you won't be able to suffer from a superstition. Isn't finding time to change to the call for coalition. Men and women treated equally without any question. I dream of such a world. Here's another suggestion. We must together put an end to this ongoing frustration, especially by providing people with quality information. Because you can never go far without proper education. On the impeding towards nation's degradation. Enough with the abuse, harm, and violation. Great damage has been done. Big congratulations about fixing the mess. Humanization, this world needs more love and a lot more appreciation by spreading awareness about this moment's motivation. Your personal contribution to the various reputation. Through these words, I too want to help improve the situation for each woman deserves dignified menstruation. For each time we've been previously teased, next time just let us bleed in peace. This is every night it fell cry. Purified, rectified, dignified. For each time we've been previously teased. Next time just let us bleed in peace. This is every night it fell cry. Clarified, justified, dignified.
नमस्ते, मेरो नाम शोभा खनाल। म यसै आरुघाट गाउँपालिका माम्बु 2 गोर्खामा अवस्थित एसए श्री भवानी माध्यमिक विद्यालयमा कक्षा 10 मा अध्ययन गर्दैछु। पहिलोचोटि महिनावारी हुँदा चाहिँ कक्षा 6 मा अध्ययनरत गर्दै थिएँ। जुन बेला म जम्मा 11 वर्षको थिएँ। मलाई महिनावारी कस्तो प्रक्रिया हो र के प्रक्रिया हो के हुन्छ महिनावारी हुँदा भन्ने बारेमा मलाई केही पनि थाहा थिएन। मैले पहिलोचोटि महिनावारी हुँदा सबैभन्दा पहिला मम्मीलाई नै भनेको थिएँ। यस्तो महिनावारी भएको बेलामा चाहिँ मेरा साथीहरू चाहिँ अन्य घरबाट जाने भएकोले मलाई त्यति बेला फर्स्ट टाइम चाहिँ एकदमै डर लागेको थियो। तर मलाई मेरो बाबाको अनुसार अरूको घरमा नजानका लागि भन्नुभयो र म घरमै बसेँ, जस कारण मलाई एकदमै सहज भयो। म पहिलोचोटि मलाई महिनावारी हुँदा चाहिँ मम्मीले नरम कपडा र सेनिटरी प्याडको प्रयोग गर्न भन्नुभयो र त्यसै अनुसार मैले पनि प्रयोग गरेँ र अन्य स्वास्थ्य समस्याहरू जस्तै पेट दुख्ने, अनि काम गर्न मन नलाग्ने, अल्छी लाग्ने, अनि त्यसपछि यस्तो कम्मरहरू दुख्ने जस्ता समस्याहरू देखा पर्दथ्यो। जुन मैले मम्मीलाई नै भनेको थिएँ र मम्मीले तातो पानी खानुपर्छ, हल्का कसरत गर्नुपर्दछ, यसबारे केही पनि डराउनु पर्दैन, यो प्राकृतिक नियम हो, यो सबै महिलामा हुन्छ भन्ने कुराहरू भनेपछि मलाई यस समस्या यो महिनावारीलाई चाहिँ एउटा सहज रूपमा लिएँ र मलाई त्यस्तो कुनै पनि डर भए जस्ता कुराहरू मम्मीबाट आउन दिएन। त्यस्तै गरी मेरो विद्यालयमा तालिम थियो, जुन तालिममा चाहिँ महिनावारी भएका साथीहरूलाई कार्यक्रममा महिनावारीलाई कसरी व्यवस्थापन गर्ने, यसलाई कसरी सहज र सरल ढङ्गबाट व्यवस्थापन गर्न सकिन्छ भन्ने कुराहरू नै सिकाउनु भएको थियो। जुन कार्यक्रममा हामीले प्रयोग गरिने सेनिटरी प्याडको पनि वितरण गरिएको थियो, जस कारणले चाहिँ हाम्रो विद्यालयमा मेन्स्ट्रुएसन भएर भाग्ने साथीहरू एकदमै धेरै थियो। लजाउने र भन्न डराउने, सरहरूलाई सोध्न डराउने, लजाउने जस्ता समस्याले मेरा विद्यार्थी साथीहरू एकदमै धेरै भाग्ने र पढाइमा त्यति निरन्तरता थिएन। जुन कार्यक्रम ल्याएपछि, जुन विद्यालयमै सेनिटरी प्याडको उपलब्ध भएपछि चाहिँ यो भाग्ने डर र पढाइमा एउटा कमी आउने समस्या चाहिँ सहजै रूपमा सरल भएको। अन्तिममा अन्त्यमा म के भन्न चाहन्छु भने अब मेन्स्ट्रुएसन हुने मेरा बहिनी तथा अन्य साथीहरूलाई एउटा मेन्स्ट्रुएसन एउटा सामान्य प्रक्रिया हो। यसलाई कुनै जटिल अवस्थाको रूपमा नलिगिकन नडराइकन आफू मेन्स्ट्रुएसन भइसकेका दिदी तथा आमाहरूलाई सोधपुछ गरी यसबारेमा थप चेतनाहरू जगाइराख्नु पर्दछ। यसलाई एउटा सामान्य प्रक्रिया हो, यो सबै महिलामा हुन्छ। यो नै एउटा सृष्टि चलाउने एउटा प्रक्रिया हो। यसलाई कुनै एउटा पाप जन्य कार्यको रूपमा नलिगिकन यसलाई सामान्य रूपमा लिगी समाजमा यस्ता अन्य मेन्स्ट्रुएसनकै कारणले अन्य समस्याहरू उत्पन्न नहोस् भन्न चाहन्छु। हस्त धन्यवाद।
Namaste, good evening, good morning, and good afternoon to all parts and corners of the globe. My name is Milia Dikari. I'm a sexual and reproductive health educator, youth menstrual activist, and director for the Global South Coalition for Dignified Menstruation North America chapter. Thank you to all our keynote speakers, our panelists, and our participants for joining us in today's session. Today's session is titled, Dignity is Key for Psychosomatic Development. Today's first session scope will cover the social, psychological, and behavioral impact of menstrual discrimination and violence for menstruators and non-menstruators. We'll explore the different roles and responsibilities of stakeholders to successfully implement such interventions so we can ensure one's dignity. Today, our keynote speaker is David Barron. David Barron is a doctor of osteopathic medicine and the senior vice president and provost of the Western University of Health Sciences. He is based in Los Angeles, USA, and he has extensive experience working in human psychology and development, and will be speaking on the impact of menstrual discrimination and violence on psychosomatic development. Then we have Prava Shankanayan. She is the CEO of the global network Mediation Beyond Borders. She has extensive experience working on emotional intelligence, sexual violence prevention, conflict mediation and mitigation, and the recovery and rehabilitation of trauma survivors. She's based in Pittsburgh, USA. Next, we have Jane Bennett. She's an educator and author in menstrual discrimination and fertility awareness, and the co-creator of the Celebration Day for Girls, an empowering intervention that aims to deconstruct the menstrual stigma and uplift menstruators. She's based in Australia. Last, we have Laxman Belbase. He's a social worker and gender justice activist working for more than 17 years in program development, implementation, and advocacy in the field of gender equality, focusing on transforming patriarchal masculinities and engaging men and boys in gender equality. Thank you so much for everybody for being here and for being here in this important dialogue to deconstruct the patriarchal notions around menstruation and to see how it affects our psychosomatic development. So I know that we have about 90 participants here, eagerly waiting to see what our dialogue is on. So let's just go ahead and step in and get started with David for your keynote speech. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. And I want to thank the organizers for inviting me. I was actually invited in person 2 years ago, so I really miss not being in Kathmandu, but this will have to do. I want to wish all of you a happy, healthy holiday season. So as you said, I'm a neuropsychiatrist by training. Most of my work has been in the area of psychosomatic medicine. And when I was the deputy clinical director of the NIMH in Bethesda, Maryland, my lab was, we focused on behavioral endocrinology, which is really looking at, and since I'm a neuropsychiatrist by training, we looked at the effects of the menstrual cycle on mood and behavior. So I have had some experience in dealing with this over the last 30 years. For the purposes of today's talk, I think it's important to start off with what is dignity? So if we look up dignity on that wonderful vehicle that we use called Google, it's the state or quality of being worthy of honor or respect. It has to do with a sense of pride in oneself and self-respect. And I think this is such an important key to what this session and these last 2 days are really all about. It should not be about why should a woman not feel a sense of pride, but quite honestly, why a woman should feel such a sense of great pride with their ability. If we talk about menstrual fluid, let's be honest, it's really not blood. We call it blood, but it's literally the substance that sustains the initiation of life following successful fertilization of an egg. So to say menses is dirty is exactly the same as saying life is dirty. Because without menstrual fluid, life could not be sustained. If an egg is not fertilized within the body no longer needs that fluid for that cycle. But it begins preparation for the potential of fertilization in that next month. It's what we call in medicine a biomarker. It reminds us that a woman is a woman, that they can sustain and capable of sustaining new life, assuring the continuation of our species. To me, this should be a source of tremendous pride in women, that they are, as a young woman, as we saw from that videotape at the beginning, oftentimes there's fear. And the reason for that fear is quite honestly ignorance. I'm not saying these are ignorant people, but ignorance about what it really is. This is the culmination of a neuroendocrine cycle that allows the human race to continue. And it's not just in humans, happens in other mammals, in all, that we're looking at menstruation as being that fluid which allows life to begin and to continue and to maintain our species. So why is there such ignorance about menstruation? Well, because people thought it was bleeding. In my field in psychiatry, they used to think that women who were very moody were called histrionic. It's a very weird term. And what it literally mean was wandering uterus, because it was felt back in ancient times that emotions were in the uterus, not in the brain, as we now know. And that so these terms were historically completely wrong, but they affected how people think, how they feel, and how they behave. And because men didn't really understand the menstrual cycle, women didn't understand the menstrual cycle, the medical field was dominated originally by men. It's only been a relatively recent phenomenon that women now account for well over 52% of physicians, is now we're starting to understand. And I think what we need to do, all of us on this call, regardless of our field, is to make a pledge to educate not only young girls and young boys, but men and women and politicians and public policymakers. I know in the United States, it's been a really remarkable phenomena that now in the House of Representatives, we actually have this dramatic increase in women. Well, we know from biological science that women literally biologically are stronger than men. Maybe they can't lift as much weight, but they live longer. And the reason they live longer is their ability to handle infection and other forms of disease. And there's a wonderfully robust literature demonstrating this. Women, I believe, make the best physicians. And I say this as a provost, and we have a medical school as one of our 9 colleges at my university, because they tend to be more empathic, more thoughtful, more caring of others, less of that alpha male phenomena that rarely leads to quality in the way of government and mentoring. So one of the things, I only had a few minutes, and we have an excellent panel, and I want to hear from them, is I think the key to dignity with menstruation, to dignity with women, is to understand that it all starts with education. And as every good educator knows, it's not what we teach, it's what our students learn. We need to make sure, we need to make a commitment that people understand what the menstrual cycle really is, how integrally it's related to life. And for the purposes of today's talk, we're talking about psychosomatic medicine, again, an area that I've been involved in most of my 40-year career. We know that stress and anxiety have a direct biological effect on not only how we think, feel, and behave, but our physical health. There's a field in medicine called psychoneuroimmunology. It's a long-winded way of saying that our emotions, anxiety and depression, have a direct impact on our immune system, our body's ability to fight disease. So when we have women who are feeling stressed or anxious, or young girls, we're literally impacting not only their emotional health and development, but their physical health. And this has been well documented. It's been an area of research of mine. I've published quite a bit on this earlier in my career, that when a woman is feeling anxious or stressed, this has a negative effect on their ability to maintain physical health, and certainly has a negative impact on their emotional development. And there is no health without mental health. That's an old saying that we hear in the United States quite a bit, but it is so true. Think about it now. Many of us might be physically healthy, but if we're worrying about the COVID virus and our loved ones, or if we go outside, or are we bringing it home, it's that fear, that anxiety, not knowing what might happen. That actually is a far greater risk to our health than probably even some minimal exposure to the virus. So we do need to wear our masks, but we need to understand that I believe what we'll see in the decades to come when we study the impact of the virus is that the greatest influence on health in a negative way and an emotional side of things and development was really the stress, the stress of worrying about it. And I think that what we need to do is understand that the education needs to start very early. It should not be starting in high school or middle school. It should be starting really in grammar school. And it shouldn't just take place within the schoolyard. Many people are finished their schooling. It should take place within a government. There should be public service announcement, just like we educate people on the importance of wearing a mask, of staying socially, physically distanced, of washing our hands. We should be educating the population, men, women, government officials, sports team, that this is a normal, important part of life. This is what helps define one of many things about being a woman, and the great pride that women should take in their role in humanity. I want to end with just my last few minutes. So I think there's a cure, C-U-R-E, that I want us to all think about as we go through this. The C stands for culture. We need to address the cultural issues, because in far too many places of the world, there are cultural norms that have a woman feel that she's unclean, or that she should stay isolated. Wellness and health need to be part of it. We need to have a culture of wellness and health. And a menstrual cycle is a normal part. In fact, when you stop having normal menstrual cycles before menopause, that's a sign of there's an endocrine problem. So the lack of it is actually a problem with health. We need to really look at behavior and leadership. Leaders need to come out. We need to actively oppose these myths, these negative myths that are used as a way of just classic prejudice, a lack of understanding and knowledge. We need unity, which I think this Congress is really all about. Supporting each other, accepting and celebrating womanhood, both for men and for women, having networks to deal with the stigma. And this is a stigma that needs to be addressed at a global level. And that's why I'm so happy to be a part of this Congress today. The R in CURE is resilience. We need to make sure that young women are able to be adaptable, that they can rely on each other. And again, this sense of being, the resilience oftentimes comes from knowledge and feeling self-assured, having that core dignity that I talked about when we first started the presentation. And then finally, efficacy for CURE. And what does efficacy mean? We have to do more than just talk about it at a Congress. This is a good start. What we need to do is make sure that this is not the end, but only the beginning of a global effort to make sure that no young girl hitting menarche, that no woman should feel in any way less of a woman, less proud of her gender because of menstruation, which is literally the fluid of life. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, David. Thank you so much for your, all this work that you put into understanding the physical and social aspect of menstruation and menstrual discrimination. And I really like the part where you said, if we consider menses to be impure, then we are saying that life is impure. I think that's really powerful to understand that, because that really tells us that when we consider menstruators to be impure and to be dirty, and we are stigmatizing and ostracizing, we're really doing a harm for ourselves, even for non-menstruators. So that's really powerful. And I really want to thank you for all the work that you've done. And, I think that, like you said, this is really a launch into dignified menstruation, into understanding that connection. So I think that this is a perfect way to segue really into Jane's work. And I know that Jane has done a lot of work in creating interventions and programs that can really deconstruct the current negative and social impact and understanding of menstruation. So first, I think I really like to ask Jane, because she's based in Australia, many stakeholders in the menstrual movement and individuals believe that menstrual discrimination only exists in the global South. But you are a menstrual activist, educator, researcher out of Australia. So could you first kind of give us a context and share some key highlights about the scope of menstrual discrimination in Australia?
Oh, hi. Thanks, Millie. Great to be here with everyone. I'd like to just start by mentioning that I'm joining you from the traditional land of the Judja Wurrung people in Australia. It's a great honour to be here with you. So, Millie, that's such an interesting question. I'm in Australia. I've been a menstrual educator for most of my adult life, one way or another, and I can certainly confirm that we have discrimination and menstrual shame here. It may take different forms. I think there's different forms in different countries. Just to give you some illustrations, in our healthcare system here, one example is that we would roughly have the same number of people with diabetes as we have women and girls with endometriosis. The government would spend last year around $4,025 per person with diabetes for their healthcare, for research, everything involved in caring for people with diabetes, and $0 spent on sufferers of endometriosis. And as many of our guests and panelists would be aware, we have a huge need to understand endometriosis and other conditions that are affected by the menstrual cycle in order to be able to diagnose more quickly, in order to be able to support with therapies and perhaps cure as well. So that's just one illustration. And another is that in our healthcare system here, we don't have either a definition or a health standard of menstrual well-being. We haven't defined it. What is it? I think many of us here could quickly define it for ourselves, but it's not a pillar of our healthcare system here. And given that a huge proportion of the population of Australia either currently menstruates or has menstruated or is experiencing perimenopause or menopause, it's incredibly important that we do start to pay attention to this and be able to define what menstrual well-being is, and then see what's downstream from that in terms of supporting women and girls with their health care needs around their menstrual cycle. I forgot to look at the time, Millie, so just wave at me if I'm if I've had my allotted. Okay, great. Thank you.
What about some social aspects that you've seen, in your work? Do you feel as though, obviously there's this huge negligence from the medical community as well as the government to take care of its people, and menstruators are its people. So in that, right, so that's the sort of the physiological side of it. And, in your work, in the intervention as well for Celebration Day of Girls, how do you feel like in the social aspect the dignity is missing, or the shame and taboo? What kind of things have you seen?
Sure. I think across our society, there is, as David mentioned, considerable ignorance about menstruation and the menstrual cycle, and a lack of holistic education. Most girls in most schools would probably receive some menstrual education here, what I would call the pads and plumbing approach, which is pretty basic. So there's very little attention to the social and emotional aspect. And there was some great research that came out of the States that studied, girls in their mid-teens, talked to girls in their mid-teens, what would have helped your experience be better? And far and away, the number one thing for them was emotional support. And we're really not offering this. We're not seeing, there's a great deal of not seeing, not understanding that this is even a thing. And for many people, they don't have the language around that and have grown up. It's the ocean we swim in, really, where we don't have the language, we don't have the words, we don't have the comfort to be able to talk to each other about periods, to be able to go to a health professional and talk about what's happening. And I would really, I think this comes back to two things. It's the menstrual taboo, just, really permeating everything, as well as a lack of holistic and comprehensive education at school, and health professionals, education professionals, and so on, really right across the board, which impacts girls' experience at school, not being able to talk about what's happening and receive the care and support they need if they're having problems, and similarly women at work. Who feel, the majority of whom feel they need to lie if they have, menstrual needs, if they're, experiencing a lot of pain or need to do something differently, instead of being able to talk to their manager and be very straightforward and having a normalized experience of being able to say, well, this is what's happening, this is what I need to do, having to actually make something up instead. So it's extremely troubling, and of course that impacts a woman's capacity to work well in her job.
Right, exactly.
To not be able to be straightforward.
Exactly. And I really like the point where you added that, it's that not having that emotional safety to be talking about menstruation, and also the words. And I think that really connects to what David was also earlier saying, in that, when someone has anxiety and is depressed and has all these symptoms that is affecting their mental health, it is going to affect their physiological health, and by that, their social standing. And I think that I'd like to move on to Prabha, and I know that she's done a lot of work in emotional intelligence and in peace building, and I think that a big part of peace building and having peace is to have emotional safety and to be able to talk about our emotions, because that's also what guides us. So Prabha, I would love if you would give us a context on, since menstrual discrimination is a global pandemic, how does menstrual discrimination destroy an individual's peace or what kind of role does menstrual discrimination play in a menstruator's sense of their internal peace, starting very much from childhood?
Thank you. Namaste. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, in all the different places in the world you are. And while I am originally from India, I am now in the space occupied by the Iroquois tribes, the Seneca, and the Mohawk. I started by thinking about my own experiences and then got slightly carried away by what both David and Jane have so beautifully spoken about, the medical aspects and the importance of education. I mean, my own experience is one of having grown up with absolutely no information because it was taboo. Clearly, I have recovered from the trauma of that experience, as have most women in India. But nevertheless, it behooves us to make sure that it does not happen to children anywhere in the world, right? So I want to go back for a moment to the idea of dignity. In my work, I spent the first 25 years of my career as a child development specialist working with children and families impacted by violence, and then the last 15 to 20 years as a peace builder with communities around the world. I've worked in Nepal and Myanmar and Indonesia and in countries in Africa. And what I come back to is the absolutely wonderful theme of dignity. And I want to add a definition to David's, and this is one that I use a lot. It was developed by Donna Hicks. You may be familiar with her work. She's a peace builder who has worked in many different parts of the world and understood the deep value of dignity, of how inherently important and integral it was to relationships. So she defines dignity as the glue that holds all of our relationships together, and as the mutual recognition of the desire to be seen, heard, listened to, and treated fairly, to be recognized, understood, and to feel safe in the world. So when dignity is violated, the response is likely to involve aggression, sometimes violence, hatred, and vengeance. On the other hand, the good news is that when people are treated with dignity, they become more connected and are able to create more meaningful relationships. Now, the implication of that for me is in how we inculcate in our cultures, in our families, in our institutions, the value of treating children with dignity. Dignity is not something one has to earn. Respect is. Dignity is something we afford inherently because people have value. So when I think about what it means for children to grow up with dignity, it means that the institutions, the culture, and the laws support their being treated like they have value, because that then contributes to children growing up in an environment that supports and nurtures their development. So imagine for a moment, as we talk about the pandemic of menstrual trauma, of the taboos associated with it, that there is a community that views menstruation as a critical part, as life-giving, as David said, and also as a time when girls and women are spiritually powerful, that it's treated as a time for recognition, reflection, and rejuvenation. You know, for the Ojibwe, an indigenous group, a tribe in this country, this was seen as a special time, without chores, who would not like that, when the girl worked on personal growth and learned from her elders. It is a beautiful and intentional consideration. It's almost a year-long celebration in this culture of the power of womanhood. So my question is, what would it be like if we celebrated instead of shamed? And for those reasons, I think it's incredibly important for us to think about the implications of practices that demean, isolate, and marginalize and inflict harm on women and girls, which is far-reaching, and it has a direct impact on their psychological and physical health, on their education, on work, and their ability to participate in activities to which they have a basic right. The denial of dignity results in a denial of their basic rights. It results in their inability to participate in key activities that contribute to human life. As David said, what is the lost potential of women whose opportunities are lost? In the face of such practices that exist, can we reasonably expect to build an egalitarian, pluralistic community where all people are treated with dignity? I think there are implications for a campaign that includes focus on education and on children's health, and I'll be glad to talk a little bit more about the policy considerations for that at a later time, because I may have failed to look at you telling me.
You're okay. That's okay. Thank you so much. No, that was wonderful. And thank you for sharing that social cultural practice. And I think that also shows us that we can change our cultural practice. We can make it so that it is an empowering one. We can make it so that we are building that connection between a menstruator and a non-menstruator, and also between menstruators, and build this unity, and so we can achieve that peace. And I think in that that critical component is also building that relationship with non-menstruators. So for this, I would love to hear from Lakshman. What I know that you've done a lot of work around, transforming patriarchal masculinities and engaging men and boys, which in cis men and boys are non-menstruators, in gender equality. So, where is the current work around menstrual discrimination in the course of Men Engage Alliance, or in terms of bodily autonomy and dignity? Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, it's a pleasure to be with such amazing panelists, and the beauty of going last is that I didn't have to build a bridge to that. I think where I would start is actually to look at the roots of where this stigma, discrimination, and oppression is coming from. I think historically, there has been a number of feminist activists who have started looking into how long patriarchy has been in place. And not that long. It's all, the figures comes around 2000 years back. But there was a different system prior to that as well, which some call a matrilineal system, which is more egalitarian system that used to be there. And to understand why, the kind of stigma and discrimination we currently attach with menstruation, or people who menstruate or menstruators, has to do with the control of sexuality and reproduction. And that's where the stem or the root of patriarchy lies. And by virtue of the system being built around the notions of men being at the center and defining their own power, and it is all about power relations, as we talked yesterday as well, and how this governs around controlling the sexuality and reproduction of women is by then men, and this men-oriented system that puts women into the lower hierarchy of the power. And that's where I think the root cause is, for any kinds of discrimination that women face or people of diverse gender identities face, is rooted. And that's what we are trying to do with non-menstruators, especially those male-identified individuals, to really help them realize that what we are doing is absolutely wrong, and it's our responsibility. So I think it's not about more on looking at what is there, but also more than that is about, as David and Jane and Prabha talked about, it's an action that needs to be done. It's talking only wouldn't lead anywhere else. We need to dismantle the system that is creating this problem, and only talking about problem doesn't help. We need to find and actively engage in solutions on the changes that we need to look at, both on all levels of life cycle, but also the layers of socio-ecological model that we talk about. And we hence need to look about the systems transformation, and that will only result into the kind of egalitarian society and equality and justice that we are talking about. And that's what we try to do with boys and men across the age range and spectrum of their identities. And also to understand that boys and men are not homogeneous groups. There are huge diversity within that. And there is majority of the men do believe on equality and justice. And how do we then bring them on board? The problem is not that many men use violence, but majority of the men remain silent. And the effort to really bring about men into this equation is to break that silence that men have been doing, occupied themselves within, and then come forward to challenge the things that are unjust issues that are there out in the community or the society or at the policy level. And that's where I think but in terms of the dignified menstruation as a topic, there is not much of the work that have happened especially with the population that are male identified individuals, but more around the sexual and reproductive health and rights and their bodily autonomy and right to abortion and so on. And that relates to the addressing of stigma, discrimination, abuse, and violence at large. But there is huge lack of conversation around dignity and menstruation within the work that we are doing. But we are slowly trying to build that effort now so that there is a better understanding of, rather than only looking at the superficial issues, the importance is that we need to go to the roots of the problem that we are talking about and try to uproot from there. And that's the kind of feminist mobilization that we try to do with boys and men and our non-menstruators in that sense, so that we can address the core of the problem.
Right. Thank you. Thank you, Lakshmi. I think that, it brings me honestly great relief to hear someone who's done so much work, working with non-menstruators to say that they do want equality. And I think that part is really good to hear because we live in this world in relationships with each other, and there's no way that we would be able to move forward or create sustainable change without engaging and having commitment from non-menstruators as well. And I really like that you said that it is also non-menstruators' responsibility and not just on the menstruator to educate and inform, but rather for them to want to learn and to deconstruct that power dynamic within themselves. So, and I really love this panel. I think that we have such great insight, and I think that, provides this sort of a relationship maker, and is, Jane has so much experience in educating menstruators, and then Lakshmi, you're in the non-menstruator side, and we have David, obviously, with his medical background. So with Jane, I want to ask you, you've done so much work in deconstructing the negative, shame and stigma and taboo for menstruators. And I know that you also include non-menstruators, primarily fathers of young adolescent menstruators, going into menstruation. So I would love if you could talk to us a little bit about what is necessary for menstrual advocates and other stakeholders to deconstruct that negative, shameful, disempowering culture, and what role do the non-menstruators as well as the fathers have in this?
Mm-hmm. It's such a great question, Millie. Thank you. I think for all of us who are actively working in this field or interested in working in this field or wondering what we can do personally in our lives, it initially comes back to our individual experience and our individual awareness, whether we are menstruators or not. So what is that awareness? I would say we're all here, panelists and audience alike, because some lights have gone off. We've had some introduction. We've had some awareness that things aren't as they should be or as they could be. And with that awareness, one of the things I suggest to people as an initial step is just notice how we think and feel for menstruators, how we think and feel about our period when it's coming, when it arrives, what our behavior is. Are we Are we feeling embarrassed? Are we feeling like we have to hide everything? Not to judge those behaviors, but just be aware of them, to notice, where they come from, because this is the way to start to tease it apart. Now, I'm speaking about a very personal way of beginning, but if we don't make that personal connection, it's very difficult to then be able to speak about it publicly or support other people in making changes. My experience with speaking with dads, and I run a workshop for fathers of daughters, but also welcome other men, so it's just for men, is that a great many would say that the education they received, whether it's formal or informal, from parents or from school, when they were growing up about menstruation was like that much. And even some men who have got 5 sisters, said that they were very much treated, there was sort of a door slammed in front of in their face, like, no, you don't need to know about this. So it really wasn't until later they had girlfriends or a wife that they started to learn more about the menstrual cycle. So it's, and I would like to think that is starting to change now. But of course, boys and men have sisters and mothers and friends and work colleagues, and often have girlfriends and wives and daughters and so on. So they're interacting with girls and women who are menstruating all the time. So I think it's very important to support men to help feel that they have a really amazing role to play to support the women and girls in their life, whether that's just making sure there are some pads and tampons in the bathroom, in the toilet, that they are responsible for. Whether that's in Australia, I talk to dads about, have some pads in your glove box of your car. It's like a little cupboard in the car. Or some men, carry it in your briefcase. If you have a lot of women colleagues and you're going to sort of conferences or meetings, we all know that the day comes when we're caught out. We don't have a product. And to normalize it, but just saying, here, I've got something, to help you with. All these things can really help. And it helps many girls, young girls who may be going through puberty or before they get their first period or in those early years. Unless they hear from their father, they think dads don't know anything. They think men are, really unaware and don't know anything about periods. And even if the father is thinking, well, I know as much as I can, and I'm interested and I care. But unless we empower them it's important to normalize. It's important to let girls know you're there for them and support them in this process, and have knowledge. And that helps girls feel much more confident. Of course, mothers are really important, and the role of mothers as someone who has experienced menstruation and can support them, but fathers as well. And I think this really helps girls feel much more confident when they have their period. If their father can just normalize and say, oh, I'm going to the shops, do you need some pads or tampons, and making the effort to know what brands that a girl likes. Some years ago, I ran a cloth pad business here in Australia, and my husband also would, if I was busy at times, he'd help me, fold them and put them together and send them out. And he knew how to, if I was washing my own cloth pads, he knew how to take them from the clothesline and fold them and put them away. And to him, that was normal. This was just part of taking care of the washing and taking care of me and us taking care of each other. So, it was very supportive of me, and I really appreciated that.
Right. No, Jane, that was so fantastic. And I think that's a really quick and simple trick you just taught all of us and our audience. If you are a non-menstruator and you are living in a world with menstruators, why don't you carry menstrual products with you as well? And that's such a simple way that you can just show not just your solidarity, but you saying that this is for everybody. This is for all of us. And I am in this with you as well. And I think that, it really made me reflect back to when, I was when I was first started menstruating, and this idea was that I should hide my menstrual products from my father. And I kept thinking, does he not know how I was made? Does he not know that this is what his wife uses? Being very perplexed at the idea that I would have to hide my products from my father, who obviously knows about menstruation and knows what age I am and where I would be entering menstruation. So I think that's a really simple way that, and I think beyond just giving your menstruator, oh, here's a pad to cover up the blood, it's more about showing that this is a very normal product that I can give you and we can talk about this, because you don't have to hide that from me. And I think that really, goes back to what David was saying, is that idea of knowing that I'm safe and secure and loved and cared for, and therefore everyone in my loved life is holding space for me. So I really love that. Thank you. And I would like to hop back into Lakshman, actually, because now that we've kind of talked about how to create that environment of safety and security and love and care and dignity for menstruators, how do you feel like, Lakshman, in your work, like what are some critical aspects that are necessary so we can really deconstruct that power dynamic? Because obviously patriarchy, even though it harms us all, it does provide privilege and power to non-menstruators. So how can we deconstruct that and, kind of educate them and make them aware enough so that they want to give up that power, so they want to give up that privilege? Because it is hard for people in power to give up privilege and power. So how can we do that?
Exactly. I think, again, referring back to the yesterday's session, it starts with, even on my personal life, the way I was introduced and got aware of menstruation and the real issues that, menstruators go through was with, because of my partner. Before that, we were two boys at home. We had no clue what menstruation is. I being the eldest son, we used to be told that you need to cook 4 days a month and you have to do that. And then my mom will sit on the corridor and tell me what to do. And that's how I learned my cooking, right? I think it's very important to work with men and boys to help them understand what actually it is, and getting information and insights on what exactly are we referring to. But I think getting awareness is one thing, but with people, because knowledge is power, and within the patriarchal system, you never know how men utilize the power. Because being a man myself, I know how men's mind work in terms of gaining more power because of the information and knowledge that we get as men, because of the access we have, because of the attention we get when it comes to the issues on anything that we would like to learn about. And within this patriarchal system, we are more prone to be getting opportunities whatsoever to be able to have more knowledge and hence more power in the patriarchal paradigm. And again, use the same power to remain in the power position. And I think that's what is crucial to be working with men and boys. It's not about men remaining in the power position or utilizing those power to remain in the positions of power, but utilize the spaces they have and inform them to be more feminist and relinquish the power dynamics. And there is an interesting concept in the feminist ideology is it's all about power with, it's not power over. And that's what we try to work with men and boys in terms of when we talk about the responsibilities, it's taking on responsibility to dismantle the system and realize that by doing so, they are not just supporting in a very technical term, supporting women, but actually creating space for women to live their rights to have a life of dignity and fundamental human rights of them as human beings, not treat them as men, I'm doing service to them. That's what we see among a lot of men and boys who do this work, is that they say, oh, I'm here to support women, they need support from men, and I'm here to do that. And that's not the language we would like. If it's a human rights based language, it's about creating, allowing the space for women to take leadership on the agenda on women's rights, and creating that space, relinquishing that spaces, the positions of power as men, is something. It's actually, honestly, if you look at and reflect it clearly, it's not about giving power. It's giving up space so that we all come to the same level of power and enjoy equality and the same level of humanity, which is the core of equality and justice that we talk about. And that's what needs to be done. So, building on to Jane's experience on working with fathers, the work with fathers have been in the engaging boys and men sector has been one of the key entry points. And the work with fathers or work with relatives or those who are associated with women and girls needs also to move beyond the gender as relational concept to bring in gender as structural issue concept, so that we work towards dismantling the structure, so that we are not only providing support for my daughter, but I'm providing support in the spaces I'm in. I'm a director in one organization. What can I do as a father? Bring that to the work I'm in or the space I'm in as well. So not limit that to the home settings, for example. Is that needs a bit more sort of momentum building and human rights approach to look at in terms of mobilization. And that is what is required at this moment, because engaging boys and men is not a goal on in itself. It is a means to achieve something. And anything to do with men and boys have to make that what is it that you are achieving or aiming at very clear from the beginning. Otherwise, we'll just be talking about counting number of men and boys joining the rally, but not these men, how many of them would go and transform the spaces that they have, transform their own home. Are they allowing equality at home? Are they allowing their women and or female members in the family to have equal rights in the public spaces? Are they challenging the sexist ideology, the misogyny that is out there in the culture? So that all needs to be incorporated in the area that we work. And that only brings the element of the focus on the human rights approach.
Thank you. That was very well said, Lakshmi. And I think that, I really like that point you made where men are not doing this for somebody else. Non-menstruators are not trying to achieve menstrual equity for menstruators. It's for everybody. And it brings me back to, this core idea that dignified menstruation is everybody's business, from Radha Patel herself, obviously. It is all in our benefit. It benefits all of us and society at large, and menstruators as well as non-menstruators. So I think that it's really, really powerful. And with this, I think that Prabha can really give us a really good insight into this, which is, correct me if I'm wrong, and, I think you are a scholar of peace building and conflict mediation. And in that, where does the work around menstrual discrimination or dignified menstruation appear in this course of peace building and conflict resolution? Because it seems like that is what we're trying to resolve with all of these social justice issues, including menstrual discrimination. So where do you see it appear, and where is it missing, and where does it actually belong?
Sorry.
Okay, there we go.
The answer to the first question is almost nowhere, unfortunately. In the peace-building world, we spend a lot of time talking about power dynamics, and I want to pick up on a couple of things Lakshmanji mentioned because I think they are very, very important. And in answer to your second, I will come back to that. I want to pick up on the theme of power and what happens in the context of both peace building and human rights. The idea that when everybody's life is supported, it's not like there's a zero-sum game. It's not as if we promote women's access, education, and resources that somebody has to lose. But there is a mythology built around it has to be at the cost of one or the other, because that's been the outcome of patriarchy, because it has been at the cost of somebody else. But what we are proposing and talking about for the last couple of days is a feminist philosophy that allows for pluralism, for the not just the acceptance and tolerance, but the support and thriving of all people. And so the idea of power having to be given up is not very welcoming. Very few people would accept that, which is partly why I think of the work in the peace building world. When I think about what needs to happen, what are the implications for women? What are the implications of not having women at the table? Let's think about the fact that, you know, about 70% of the frontline healthcare workers during this pandemic are women. That should be of great importance to us. And this is another area that benefits greatly from the inclusion of women, and that is the area of peace building. And I'll tell you why. Because when you negotiate agreements, when you are gathering people in order to make decisions, ensuring that all voices are heard, and that we address the power imbalance when women are not in that circle, is critical. And that's something that gets addressed when women are part of the process. I mean, the reality is that if you look at the research in the last 10 to 20 years, despite all of the wonderful resolutions like the Security Council Resolution 1325, which was a turning point, what we see is that women participate in very few of these processes. And the reason I think that's important is because the impact of violence, the impact of displacement, the impact of the taboos that we're talking about are disproportionately felt by menstruators. And so having them at the negotiating table, having them in those spaces where decisions get made is critically important. Having their participation because they bring a perspective that is unique. Now, it shouldn't depend on agreements that are generated in national or international processes. I think there are implications for a dignified menstruation campaign. And that for me begins with affirming the trauma and loss caused by taboo and stigmatization, and considering any stigma, taboo, or restriction linked to menstruators as a violation of human rights. Using community dialogues. Now, we use dialogues for a lot of different purposes. But one of the key ways is to engage stakeholders in identifying and addressing the harm caused by these practices. I mean, as I heard Lakshman describe his experiences with men, as I've heard other women describe the experiences of men and their families, what it sometimes takes is an engagement and an education. I mean, very rarely have we found people who care about the women in their lives to not be able to address it. And yet, for women of my generation, it was not something that was talked about, right? And yet we are raising children to be understanding of and participate in it in a very different way. So the reason I think about this being really important is that the other thing is that we need to engage community-wide participation and policymakers in public dialogues to raise an awareness of this issue. I will tell you, until I met Radha, I wasn't talking about dignified menstruation. I was only talking about women's rights. I was talking about women's participation. And so Radha's brought a whole, opened a whole window of aspects of discrimination that I didn't focus a whole lot of attention on. There are a couple more things I will say about that. The other is that menstrual management supplies, and I see this, you know, in addition to integrating menstruation with dignity into health, education, and gender policies and strategies, when I look at, I'm looking particularly at this time of displacement, the largest displacement in the population of the history of mankind, 65 million people internally and on the move, right? And guess what? Menstruators are a significant part of that population, but do you see disaster relief supplies focusing on it? Mm-hmm. So the last thing I would say about the implications for a dignified menstruation campaign is that menstrual management supplies must be included in the list of essential supplies like PPEs and other health supplies for COVID-19 and other kinds of emergencies. So there are very specific steps I would like us to think about, in addition to the fact that the discrimination against menstruators means that there are fewer women at the tables at which these decisions are being discussed, negotiated, and made. Their participation, if they are treated with dignity and included in processes, ensures that their needs are addressed at the policy level. So for me, there's a direct connection between the support of young children at a young age, having this information, and therefore being able to participate with a greater sense of agency and information. I'm not sure if I exactly answered your question, but there you go.
No, you did wonderful, Buzzy. And I think that, this idea that you need support from all different stakeholders, right? This idea that every part has to be working together in order for us to make sustainable and transformative change. And it has to come from all different policy levels and has to be, like you said, in the international papers, but also in actual practice, in behavior, exactly, in the present sense, and not just signing away, commitments to things that we are just talking about, but rather putting it into actual practice. And, I think that I would love if David could also give us a little insight into how, we're talking a lot about how dignity or the lack of dignity is really playing a major role in menstruator psychology. So how or what have you seen, David, in your work, as a professor and as a doctor, in seeing how does the lack of dignity present itself in the psychosomatic sense for patients and for your students? What have you seen? And I think that you're mute, David, so if you could unmute yourself.
Yeah, sorry. I think, as was mentioned earlier, dignity has a lot to do with self-esteem and self-respect. And the lack of that can be a true stressor, feeling that less about oneself, not having that self-confidence because you're told by others that, that you're dirty or you're unclean or that you're less competent to do things. And that sense of self becomes very important in emotional development from a very young age, that if we grow up feeling that we're important and we're valuable, that has a very positive effect on our emotional development in a whole host of areas, and it's directly related in health. So if we look at individuals, if we look at children who've been exposed to significant emotional trauma, they turned out to be much sicker. There's a quick story that the children during World War II in London, the children who were from poor families had to stay with their families during the bombings when the Germans were bombing. If you were rich, you could send your children out into the countryside where they'd be safer. There have been some wonderful studies that have followed these children. The children who were poor but stayed with their families and were given support and had that emotional loving actually turned out to be much healthier than those who were away from their families, who were stressed or, why was I sent away? So I think when we look at this and we look at psychosomatic, you cannot extract one's emotional sense of self. When we're feeling good about ourselves, our bodies respond in a healthy way. When we're feeling stressed, when we're feeling anxious, and in fact, this can be very, very, there's been a 40-year field now looking at measuring people when we're stressed or we're depressed or we're anxious. We can measure that in our immune system, every single aspect of our immune system, the body's ability to fight disease. Without an immune system, we're dead. That's what the other virus taught us, HIV/AIDS. So I think when we look at this isn't about just doing the right thing. This is about the health and well-being. And I think the comments that probably were so accurate that we need to understand this from a biopsychosocial perspective. Biologically, what does it mean? We educate people, but then the psychosocial and what it means about the development and the health and well-being of not only menstruators, but non-menstruators as well.
Thank you, David. Yes. So, it's just such a powerful message. And is that, the biological, the psychological, and the social are all connected. And, there was at one point we thought the brain and the body weren't connected. There was a time when we thought that, the psychic and the physiological wasn't connected. And so now, after understanding that, I think that now, it's beyond the time, but at least we're doing the work now to really understand that menstruation is a critical aspect of our physiological, psychological, and social health, and that it is really a vital sign of our health, and in both in the sense of physiological and social and biological. And we've had such a great panel today, and we're getting near to the end. How quickly the time has gone by with, such fabulous dialogue. And I think I would love to really hear about sort of a closing statement from each panelist. And in that, what do you believe is, your final point to how can we make our society aware of menstrual discrimination, and how do we really understand and deconstruct this negative, shameful taboo? And I think I'll start with Lakshmanji.
Oh, okay. Was coming. I think for me, if we really are looking towards moving to the vision that the Global South Coalition has in place, a couple of things. I guess for me, this work cannot be a development project. It was highlighted yesterday as well. It should move to a societal transformatory approach and a movement building approach under the leadership of feminists as well. That is very important to highlight. On top of what David was saying on biopsychosocial aspect, I would also add on the conversation from a human rights perspective. Also add intersectional feminist approach needs to be added to that, because only looking at biology will not help in terms of the systemic transformation we are looking at from a human rights perspective, and that I would definitely add. Otherwise, we will revolve around again, sort of providing sanitary pads and so on, and talk about menstrual hygiene, but not talk about the human rights of the people that you are providing these services to. And I think that connection to as a fundamental human rights needs to be made. And I have seen in my family that is possible. My partner is currently, sort of reminding me that sometimes it's not only enough to talk about, but you have to take a bold step yourself, because there is so much of resistance, there is so much of pushback, all at home level, at community level, talk about UN spaces where the most pushed back agenda when it comes to women's rights and gender equality is sexual and reproductive health and rights, and even more so to talk about dignity and rights of human rights defenders. You name it, that's been one of the crucial elements in the international policy space, where all the time has always been pushed back so much. And I think it's time that we come together in solidarity with each other and join hands to create a parallel force to push back the pushback that we are experiencing when it comes to feminist gender equality agenda. And within that, since we all are born and brought up within patriarchy, not assume that the issue of dignified menstruation will just come without us being in this space and highlighting that this needs to be, and making sure that it becomes part and parcel of the human rights agenda being discussed. Otherwise, I think the human rights agenda will just be a development project as it has been, and move away from Eurocentric colonial approach to looking at human rights and defining human rights, but deconstruct the true humanity aspect and bring that element into the work we are doing.
Right. No, thank you so much. I really like the part where you added, I think that, yes, there is a big white savior mentality in social justice work, and in that it has really impacted the menstrual movement, and in that we're thinking of always about products and giving products to people who don't have it, to poor people, always kind of blaming other regionals and other marginalized populations. So I really do believe I agree with you in that it really has to be about a human being's dignity, and it has to be that we want to achieve a life and a society that values that dignity. Thank you so much, SMG. Brother, please enlighten us with some more powerful words and ways of how we can achieve, and what approach can we take to building peaceful relationships and to really achieve this dignity. You're mute, Prabha. We cannot hear your beautiful voice.
I know, I keep forgetting. It's the meme of the year, isn't it? I will say something that we often say in the peace building world, which is that peace begins within, change begins within. And creating spaces for people to address their own biases and fears, their frustrations and their hopes. And I'm talking not just of menstruators, but of those who oppress with the taboos and the practices that oppress, can gradually build the trust and understanding among groups who may have never shared their ideas about these practices. Now, there are so many cultures in the world in which the idea of gathering a group of men to talk about the life-giving force of the menstruators in their community is still taboo. We know that. But that's where I think it is enormously important to focus on the change that needs to come from within, and to create the spaces for people to address their own biases and fears. And that change is possible when people are able to voice their frustrations, and it might be ignorance, surface their fears about it. Who knows what the beliefs are in so many of these cultures that men to whom there has been no conversation, no education, hold. And think about the possibility that we can use the mediative practices to create spaces in which those conversations can happen, where those threats can be addressed, where those biases may dissolve. What we know about the neurobiology of change, it clearly points to the importance of the human connection and the power of creating shared narratives. And those are the tools I think about. How about creating narratives of power and strength, of connecting with each other, and creating community around the value and the importance of supporting menstruators? These are tools that peacebuilding offers to social change efforts, such as those focused on dignified menstruation. So if the dignity of all people and peaceful coexistence is our goal, we have to overcome the silence that surrounds some of these most damaging practices. And so I think using dialogues, using solution circles, creating shared narratives can be extremely powerful tools. And these are the possibilities I see for changing the narratives on menstruation. From charity, it's not a project, as Lakshman said, to human rights, from hygiene to dignity, from impurity to purity, and from 5 days to a life course approach.
Exactly, really well said. I've just been informed we do have a little bit more time, so I would like to ask you one more question to that. You talked about culture and this, idea of resistance in particular cultures maybe are more powerful or can seem more daunting than others. And in that, what is one suggestion that you can give to, young adolescents or older ones or, in all ranges to creating that movement or even initiating that movement of change, but keeping peace? Is that possible? Or do we have to be circuit? What do you think?
Absolutely. I think it is. There is so much we have changed, which is the good side of all of this, right? And I would point to a couple of people on the panel here and say, finding champions like Lakshman, finding champions like David in communities is enormously important for young adolescent boys, and finding people that they look up to. It begins with that kind of championship for some of them. And for others, I think it is engaging peers in a conversation where addressing what they're afraid about happens. Because in those communities, what I also know is that nobody's telling those boys about what their sisters are going through, what the menstruators are going through, because the subject itself is such taboo in some of these communities. Nobody is talking to the boys about them. So it would be really a challenge. But I think finding champions within the community is a big part of what I have found to be true of whether it comes to conversation about race, whether it comes to conversation about prejudice, whether it comes to women's rights, for a lot of issues, for gender-based violence, for sexual abuse, for domestic violence. I think for too long, the victims have carried the burden. And we are fortunate that in the last 10 years, we have seen more of those who are not the typical victims. And I'm not saying that there are not victims amongst all of us, but I think for too long that burden has been carried from a victim's perspective rather than from that of a human rights perspective and a community perspective.
Right. Oh, excellent. And, with that, I think really connects to Jane's work. And I would love to hear, Jane speak a little bit about how can menstruators really, for menstruators, how can they, kind of grow that relationship with their family members or loved ones or guardians, and how have you seen in your work how that has worked out well, and how have, menstruators with their family members really grown and been enlightened in their relationship with their menses? And any other closing remarks, we'd love to hear from you.
Thanks, Millie. In my work with girls and mothers and daughters and schools, what I've really seen is the incredible difference it can make for a girl's experience of pre-menarche and then starting to have a menstrual cycle if there is really good quality information and positive support. There was a really great study that happened here in Australia that showed this very clearly, is that where there is, where a girl is well informed and she has a positive and honoured experience of her menarche, it makes a difference on a whole lot of fronts, very significantly on her self-esteem, on her menstrual health, her experience of her period going forward, on her sexual decision-making, and even later on her birth experiences. Of course, stats are stats. It doesn't mean everybody is going to have, a fabulous experience of those things, but it significantly makes a difference to be able to have a positive experience of menarche. And one of the things I say to families is, for most, I don't know about every culture, but for most women in Australia, if we talk about, well, how was it for you when you experienced menarche? It's not celebrated. Even if someone says, oh, it's it's natural and congratulations, but don't talk about it. Keep it all secret. The message girls are getting is often quite mixed, that it's something we don't talk about. We don't talk to the men about it. We don't talk to the boys. You have to hide your products. So it can be hard for them to, well, what's the truth here? I also think for all of us who are interested in this field, and this has been a growing understanding of mine over the years, it's important for us to really understand the power of shame and the power of menstrual shame, obviously specifically. And Brene Brown defines shame as different from guilt. Guilt being, oh, my behavior was wrong. There was something, I did the wrong thing. Whereas shame is, I am wrong. I am essentially wrong or dirty or bad in some way. So shame is very unconscious. It's very sticky, and can morph from one thing to another, but it's not irrevocable. We can change that. And the things that can really help us with shame are what many of us are doing, and even attending a conference like this makes a huge difference for us to talk about it, to be able to connect with others rather than feeling isolated and alone in our shame, to be able to communicate and to be able to give and receive empathy around the experience of menstruating, or around the experience of how do we support the women and girls in our life, or how do we support our community, to be able to keep discussing that in a non-judgmental way. And sometimes we can even be judgmental about the practices that shame. It's very, very sticky. And I've learned over time that, you know, we're all in this particular soup. We all, even if we don't identify as having menstrual shame ourselves, we all are part of this culture, and sometimes it will manifest in, oh, I don't want to make other people uncomfortable, so I won't talk about it. And I've learned that in many instances, by saying, yes, this is what I do and this is why, even if that's sort of pushing the comfort zone a little bit, often people are really relieved and the door's open and they're really happy to talk about it and want to share their experience. So I encourage all of us to just push our comfort zone a little bit, and a little bit more and a little bit more, to you know, be creating light through this culture of menstrual shame that we have across the world. But as Prabha was saying, and Lakshman, you know, this is changing. This conference is changing it. All our work is changing it. All our conversations. We're in a very different place now than we were 10 years ago or 20 years ago, and it's very exciting times.
Definitely, Jane. And I really like that part. You know, I really love your distinction of shame versus guilt. And I think that's a really core component. And I think it really reminds me of when we talk about, you know, why didn't so-and-so report sexual assault? Why didn't so-and-so talk about their attempted rape or when they were raped? Why didn't they report? Why didn't they talk about it? Why did they go and sit in the hut for their menses day? Why are you ashamed about menses? You know, it's when we are saying that I am shameful, that means I am bad, and inherently believe that, then we are also going to believe that we deserve all of that discrimination and that violence, and that we are deserving of that because we are inherently bad. And it's a really critical insight. And, you know, I thank you for that, because I think it's really important to understand is when we do not empower our menstruators with, you know, positivity and as well as, you know, dignity, then we are saying that they are not deserving of good things inherently. And therefore, these are all things that are supposed to happen to them because they're inherently bad and shameful and taboo. So thank you for that, Jane. Before we move on to the chat box, we look for different questions, because I know it's been really chattering in there and looks really great, and I'm really happy to see that so many participants are having internal dialogue about this as well. I would love if David, if you gave us a little bit of a closing remark and let us know about, you know, how can we really build that connection between the physiological impact of menstrual discrimination and psychological, and any other closing remarks you'd like to give us?
I know we're running late, so I want to keep mine focused because there's been some wonderful information shared. To me, the issue is changing a culture. We've got a long legacy of a culture, whether it's shame or doubt or prejudice, and I think it's wonderful to talk about it. What we have to do is understand, how do we change culture? It doesn't change overnight. You know, it's like they say, turning the Titanic. You know, it's going to take time. I think education is a key issue. I could not agree more that the issue of dialogue, telling a story. We all learn from our parents by telling stories, not by sharing facts. So facts are important, but when we communicate with each other, when we respect each other enough to want to listen to a story that we can relate to, oftentimes relating to science is not the easiest thing to do if you're not a scientist, but yet we can use the tenets of science to create a conversation, to talk to each other so that people understand. Part of changing a culture is kind of what's in it for me. And I think there were some wonderful comments that Lakshman made. This isn't about giving something up, but it's actually expanding it. So I think that anything we can do to help change the culture, use a biopsychosocial and a spiritual perspective. spirituality, I think, should not be left out of this. So I think, again, since we're running late, I didn't know we were going to run late. I've got to get on another. I thought 8 o'clock would be plenty late here in Los Angeles, but I think this is an important beginning. If we can change the culture from a variety of different perspectives, I think there were some wonderful things shared today, and that if we all make a commitment to that, it will take time, but we need to be moving in the right direction. And I think this is a wonderful step, and that we just address it from as many perspectives as is possible.
Thank you so much, David. Thank you for your participation. And we don't want to keep you from another engagement, but thank you so much for joining us.
Happy holidays. Stay safe and wear your masks.
Thank you so much, David. That was such a great insight from David as well. And so in the end, I really, again, I want to thank all of the panelists. It's been such a great dialogue, and to our keynote speaker, David, and to our participants. So I just want to end with saying some of these comments that people have been leaving. First is that they think that all of you are really powerful speakers, and I totally agree with them. Others have said, Anju Bhatta has said, good to know male perspective and experience expressed. It was great. Thank you. Others have said that Ishori Basant has said, agreed, Jane. Men also need to recognize their own power and privilege and use it to end violence against women or menstruating people. I have a story here from, a really great story from Simran Khatri, who has said that, good morning, everyone. This is Simran Khatri. I am a MHM facilitator from Nepal, and I'm talking about men's role in my family. From my first period, it is my father who brings the sanitary napkin home, and this has now passed on to my brother. And when he first went to the shop to buy it, he shared the experience about how the shopkeeper stared at him in shock and wrapped the sanitary napkin in newspaper as if he was a smuggler. I think that's really funny and really true. And I think that really goes back to a lot of our own perspectives of hiding menstrual products in our sleeves as if we're hiding drugs, and asking, other menstruators in the bathroom, hey, do you have an extra? Not saying the word, saying as if it's some sort of a drug. Do you have an extra? And they know, just simply by that look. So I totally agree with that. Someone else said, as if buying sanitary pads was illegal. Others have said, Luxembourg has a great point. I really appreciate your words. Radha Koyala from Nepal says, in my experience, men are playing main roles in the rules and regulations of all household members, who does and does not what. Women are mostly monitoring and following set rules. Very agreed. Others have really said that education with boys needs to start early, and the role of men within the household and community is very important for menstrual discrimination. Menstrual shame is real. I have faced it when I was menstruating for the first time. This has been really, really, really great content from the participants as well. And I know that we really started, I think that the wheels were already turning, and we're really oiling it, getting into high gear. And I really want to thank all of the participants, really. Again, with everything that all the panelists have said, it all starts within, and it all starts in our minds, and it all starts in our hearts. And once we have achieved that internal dialogue, and when we internally believe that dignity is at center, then we can make those changes externally as well. So thank you so much to all the panelists. It has been a great honor to be your moderator, and I know that this is just a beginning of a beautiful, beautiful dialogue as well as real hard work. Thank you so much.